I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I've been reading Lorrie Moore for, well, a while. And every single book has been an absolute delight for me, and I'm so happy she's here because this new book, I Am Homeless If This Is Not My Home, we're going to dance around some of this book, and I'm smiling like a mad woman as I think about it. It is 192 very tight pages. It's 2 storylines. It is really terrific character. I love these characters. I love Elizabeth. I love Finn. I love Lily, Max, all of them. And then we have an unnamed actor that we're going to get to as well. But Lorrie, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. It's such a pleasure to see you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's very fun to be here.
So, I Am Homeless If This Is Not My Home is your first book in a bit. I mean, it's been a while. When did you start working on this new book? I feel like you've been hinting at it sort of over the last few years, saying, well, I'm working on this thing. I'm working on this.
Work on this weird thing. Well, and I did research for it at the Coleman Center in New York. I had a fellowship, 2017, 2018, I think that was. I had begun a little bit of it before, but I needed time to do it.
So the 2 storylines. We've got this fellow called Finn who's driven in from the Midwest to the Bronx. His brother is in hospice, and he's come specifically to see his brother. And Finn also has, I guess we call her former girlfriend, Lily.
I guess it's a former girlfriend.
Yeah, they seem to have been a little broken up at this point, but
they're kind of broken up. He's not. He's still very much emotionally involved.
He's not over it. He's
not over it, and she might not be over it either. Who knows?
Well, I don't think she is either. But
yeah.
Then we have a second storyline though that's set in the American South in, post-Civil War, but certainly not present day.
I think there's one little sentence that gives the year away. I think it's about 1870, 1871, okay. But, around there.
So we've got Elizabeth writing letters to her sister in that period. And then we have essentially Finn and Lily in the present day. How did we get these 2 storylines in this project?
Well, that is an excellent question. And it's a question my editor at Knopf asked me straight off when I put the manuscript in. So I had to sort of explain things, and I had to redo a couple things. Both these stories were in my head, and then I realized I had things in common. And I knew that you could do a contemporary story with an historical one. Many authors have done that, and there can be overlap. And I thought of Tom Stoppard's play, Arcadia, which uses that house. Dramas that are occurring centuries apart are still simultaneously within that house. And so I thought I would steal that. Apparently Tom Stoppard stole it from someone else. So I heard him say that in an interview. So I thought, okay, well, I won't feel guilty. But I guess he said it was some classic thing in theater that you use the house and you have, time differential with the 2 dramas that are occurring within it. So I decided that these stories had things in common. They had communion with the dead. They both had a kind of ne'er-do-well guy named Jack. And they had this boarding house in common and some other things. And I decided I could go back and forth and, with luck, make it clear that there are connections between these 2 stories.
There's also, I'm going to take a second and quote you, quoting Alice Munro for a second. Something I stumbled across in the essay collection while I was prepping for the show. Love never dies. And there's a lot of love in this book. There's familial love, there's sibling love, there's romantic love. There's all sorts of love in this book, right? And you write about siblings in a really cool way.
It's something I noticed only when I was completing this novel, that there's siblings in all of them. And there's also protagonists who are carried away by a slightly imaginary love in all my novels. And I didn't even realize that until I thought, well, what does that mean? And I just couldn't go there. But it's somehow a sense of love as a distraction from filial bonds and duty and all of that. I have to say about the Alice Munro quote, I can't remember which story that is in, but she has the character say, "Love dies all the time." She responds to it. She says that's the sort of stupid thing people think is true, but it's not. It's not. And yet, in this novel, it's true. Love doesn't die.
There are so many fun moments in this book. And I knew the book was coming and I got the galley and I read it cold because it had been a while since I had anything sort of super new to read from you. And the essay collection was fun. But this book is even more fun. This book is wild, Lorrie Moore. This book is wild. It's so great.
It's a little bonkers. Yeah, I knew it. I didn't show it to anyone when I was writing it because I thought no one's going to get it. And so, I waited until I'd finished it to turn it in. And then I tinkered with it a little bit after. But I didn't, it's the first time I've written a book and not shown anyone during the process.
Okay.
So that's when you really know you're in crazy land, that other readers are not going to get what you're doing until you have finished it. And then with luck, they will.
And you've had the same agent and the same editor for every single book since Self-Help, right?
I have. It's
okay, so you didn't even show them, and they've known you for a really long time.
I showed them once I had a draft.
Okay.
And then I did make some changes afterward. I had what I thought of as a finished draft. And then I turned that in, and they had responses. And I made some changes. But usually I show it to a couple writer friends and I say, tell me if there's something really wrong here. But I didn't do that this time.
Because there's a lot of what I consider Lorrie Moore writer in this book. The dialogue is great. The humor is there. And there's so much payoff in this book. There's so much good, funny Lorrie Moore wit in this book, even though I can't stop thinking about it, but I also can't stop laughing because you pulled it off entirely. And I know people are going to be listening to the show thinking, what is going on? And all I want to say is it's 192 pages. You can read it very quickly and you'll fly through the story. And all of the things I think of when I think of your short stories are there. The way you describe what's happening in this world and what's happening between Finn and Max and Finn and Lily and Elizabeth and her sister and Elizabeth and her gentleman boarder, the actor who's staying in her boarding house.
Yeah.
I know you said this book feels really wild, and yes, I would not disagree with you. And yet, when did you decide that this was the project, that you were just going to commit completely to this idea?
I suppose when I was at the Cullman Center, I never set out to write an historical novel, but as I did the research and as I had this other story of grief in my head, I thought these stories of grief are really speaking to each other in some way. Maybe all stories of grief speak to one another. And so, at the Cullman Center, I did the historical research and I did way too much research.
Okay.
And that's the way I just suddenly thought, I want to come back as an historian in my next life. I did more research than I used. It was very interesting, and some of the research is in there, and I wanted the back and forth between present day, we'll say, and present day politics. 2016, it's the election of Trump, and I thought, the idea of the Confederacy never dying is in both parts. So I had both things going on. Now I wrote them pretty much the way they appear in the book. I didn't write the letters separately and intersperse them. I really did it exactly as it was to be read, which might be a little weird. It's certainly not very David Mitchell of me.
You gave Elizabeth a really great line, though, and talking about everything that you just mentioned. It does seem this place has been handed some moment in history that's grown fearful and impulsive about hanging on to it. And I was just kind of like, oh, hi. And that's very early. That's early. It's possibly her second or third section in the book. And I just thought, okay, I'm in. I was already in from her first letter to her sister, and then we meet Finn and Max, and then I was like, oh, I need to see what's going on.
Well, that's great. I'm so happy to hear you say that, because when there are so many sections, often people prefer one to another, and when they have to move on to another section, they miss the other one, or I don't know. There can be preferences in any kind of bicameral narrative, or even within a single narrative. If there's themes, relationships that you are more attached to than others, you can think that the whole thing is unbalanced. But I hope it all works as an assemblage, I'll say.
I wanted to know how you were going to connect everything. That's what I really needed to know. I was like, okay, I see the parallels, but I really needed to know how you were going to bring this together. There are other writers who would have brought it together in a different way, or maybe never would have come up with any. But when you brought it together too, I was so pleased. I figured it was either going to connect in a physical way or an emotional way, and you actually gave me both.
I hope, oh, good. Thank you. I hope there's both. I mean, there is one moment where Elizabeth, when she's handing over the dead body, we'll say that there's a couple of dead bodies in the.
There are. Oh, yes, there are.
She says, well, it's a bit of a custom in these parts to drive around the countryside with a dead body in your vehicle. Of course, as I lay dying is the reference point there. And I have a little quote at the beginning. I use the quote as an epigraph from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. So there, in both sections, there is that driving around with someone who may or may not be dead, may or may not be who you think they are. So there's that parallel.
There is, and I'm going to go back, and this was an excuse to sort of jump back into some of my favorite Lorrie Moore stories, and Real Estate is one of those stories from Birds of America. And if you haven't read the story, I'm just going to say, go read it. You can either find it in Birds of America or it's in the Collected Stories, which was reissued in 2020 with a fabulous introduction by Lauren Groff. So either of those, because I'm not going to spoil the book for you, but what I am going to say is there's a description of the art of fiction and the purpose of fiction that shows up in Real Estate. This is the kind of thing that fiction is. It's the unlivable life, the strange room tacked onto the house, the extra moon that's circling the earth, unbeknownst to science. I'm just like, well, yes, this is exactly what you're doing in this book. It is so much fun. And yeah, I did follow you down the rabbit hole, and I wasn't entirely clear what was going on maybe in the first couple of sections. And then I started to put it together because the voice is so good and it matches each of the sections, even though one is, clearly historical and one is present day. The voice matches. There's that sort of raised eyebrow to the world. I think each narrator, both Elizabeth and Finn, sort of have this unreliable streak. The idea of balancing the voice so that you're not giving more weight to one piece, because the two need each other. The two storylines need each other, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for saying that. I mean, not every reader will have that experience. They'll start with one voice and either prefer that or prefer the next one that comes along, but they alternate. So if you keep going through the book, they're both there. Yeah, the one is in first person because of letters, and the other is close third, tracking the hapless Finn. I was telling someone I have colleagues who have, after I started this book, I was very attached to these names, Finn and Lily, and two of my colleagues, poets, got dogs. One of them named Finn and the other one named Lily. And I just thought, oh no, I can't deal with these dogs named Finn and Lily, and also write characters. But I was too far into the novel to change the names. So now I have to go back to Nashville and, of course, deal with these dogs. Finn and Lily.
I do want to talk about the humor, though, because I think, especially when you're writing about grief and death, humor is something that people sometimes forget. I mean, it's that valve too, right? It's the pressure valve for any human being who's experiencing any of that. But also, I can't separate you from this very sort of dry, witty, wry, like your dialogue still just sings. And in this book too, I mean, there are a couple of moments where I was laughing out loud.
Oh, well, good. I did think of it as all very sad, but and not a funny book necessarily. There's always funny things in life. You don't really even have to make them up. You just have to pay attention. They're just there. And for the dialogue for the brothers and for Finn and Lily, I mean, they're in close quarters. They're in impossible circumstances. And so there would be tension, and there would be humor. There's always some humor in hospice. There's always some humor on a car trip. And that's just the way people are, because everybody's trying to cheer each other up. Now, there's also other stuff in there. It's just music dialogue, but it is how people speak, I think. I notice everyone being funny all the time. So I did want to capture that. It gets a little unfunny maybe toward the end, but it needs that too. It needs to have a kind of.
I know the moment you're talking about, and that particular exchange, I think it shows a real sort of sea change in Finn. There's something he says to another person where you're like, oh. But here's the thing. I know what he says, and I know who he says it to, and I don't know if it's going to stick. Because that's one of the things about Finn where I'm like, is this going to stick? I mean, Finn's very sort of focused on Finn and his life and his interpretation of life. And I'm like, I would like to think that Finn might be able to move on, but I'm not sure I trust him.
Who knows? I mean, does one ever move on from someone they love dying? Sort of yes, sort of no.
Right.
And that's what the book is. It's like, here's the partial way you move on. Here's the partial way you don't move on. And so it's existing in that sort of nether zone. It's also a little bit of, I mean, to the extent that Finn is a little self-absorbed, it's about his non-comprehension of her mental state, which is a mystery. I mean, I think the kind of mental suffering that she has is a mystery to others. And you can never really quite get to the bottom of it, even if you love them dearly. You can't really fathom it. And he brings his non-comprehension all the way through the book. He doesn't ever reach he touches on some understandings here and there, but mostly he's got his rageful non-comprehension that is driving him. And sometimes that's part of the comedy and the tension and the dialogue, and sometimes it's just part of the sadness.
I genuinely believe that we experience life sort of in a balance of emotions, right? Like you can't have joy if you don't have sadness because you have nothing to compare it to. And that's, when I'm reading your work, really specifically the stories, but certainly the new novel, certainly I look to you to be able to raise an eyebrow at stuff where I know some people might not have the same response that I'm having, but there's an honesty to what you're saying and how you're saying it that I so appreciate. And maybe that just says I have a really black sense of humor.
Well,
it might
my perfect reader.
It might be my very dark sense of humor, but the idea that, you have to have all of the stuff in order to have life, right? The question is, do we have the language to represent all of the stuff as we experience it?
Sometimes if you just put those different levels of language down and ask them to sort of smash into each other, you can both the comedy and the tragedy occur. I actually have great admiration for stand-up, and I was watching Wanda Sykes' new special. I don't know if you've seen it. And I don't think it's as great as her other ones, but there's a moment that just had me laughing out loud. And she's trying to be a guy who is going through the hot flashes of menopause while she's just imagining this, she's creating this, while he gives the quarterly earnings report in a company meeting. So it's like he's got the PowerPoint figures and the graphs and the corporate language going on at the same time. She's made up a language for male menopause that he's also suffering from. And so the collision of those two rhetorical levels, it's what's so funny. And she does that. She did that very, very well. Mm-hmm. I just had great admiration for that. But that's also sometimes the definition of surrealism, mm-hmm. two completely disparate things sort of suddenly together. But it certainly is the definition of humor. Something's out of context and smashing into something else. This book has a lot of that.
Oh, it does. It's so satisfying. I'm also just thinking there's a twist that pops in the letters when you realize something that Elizabeth has been withholding, and it does not deal with the gentleman boarder or the gentleman actor, excuse me. And I was laughing so hard. I was like, of course, this makes a ton of sense. And it has something to do with her sister. But there's a lot of that kind of, what do we do with our secrets? How do our secrets define us? How do we put our secrets out into the world or not? I want to go back to Lauren Groff for a second. She, as I said, had written this wonderful introduction to the collected stories. And
terrific.
She is great. And she is also a former student of yours as Madyson, as was Emma Straub, which I love the idea that there's a direct lineage between you and two of my favorite women on the planet. One of the things Lauren talks about in that introduction that anyone who has read your work knows is just this, there's this Lorrie Moore voice that really cannot be imitated, right? Like it's so wildly unique. It seems like you've had it all along, though. It feels like we start with self-help, and and I can see the through line, and I can see sort of this raised eyebrow, right, that you have for all of us.
That's great. I think a writer might be the last to know about the through line between their work, because to get work written, you have to feel that it's new. You have to feel, oh, this is something I haven't done before. And so that's what I had to feel with every single thing that I wrote. Like, this is new and different. And Lauren writes that way. I just spent time with Lauren in Berlin. I was at the American Academy in Berlin with her. We were fellows together. It was really fun. She was there with her beautiful family, and it was just really nice. So there may be certain aspects of style in the sentences. There's still, you're writing to your ear. You're writing probably to the same ear, even though you think you're doing something that you've never done before. That inner ear is still probably the same inner ear. It may be modified as you go through life a little, but musicality, the sense of rhythm is probably just there always. And if you write at all in a poetic way or in the first person, if you're worried about how a humorous line has to scan, you're writing to that inner ear for its rhythms and its sound. So the sound of a book, the sound of a story, those are very, very key. And even though you may feel you're writing a brand new book, sound may be reporting into the same inner ear that the author has. I hope there are differences among the books. And I always hope that I've gotten better, but I probably have just gotten different a little bit in terms of subject matter and all of that. But you have to feel that as you go through life as a writer. You have to feel this next book is new, this next book is different, and you have to hope that your best work is ahead of you. I still think that at my old age, I think, oh, my best work is still ahead. Hang on for 5 more years. I'll have another book.
Oh, please. I can be patient. Oh, I can be, no. I can be totally patient. And I have a subscription to the New York Review. So I'm good. I'm okay. I can hold on. I'll be fine. But I'm just thinking about what you said just now, that there are certain elements that I know I'm going to get. And I say this even in regards to like your television criticism, like you've written about The Wire and you've written about True Detective and you've written about Friday Night Lights. And even there, I know I'm reading a piece by you, but I was never really expecting you to write about television, though I'm glad you did.
I never expected to
Really?
write.
Okay.
It was a very weird journey because I wasn't really a television person. I just happened to spend a summer watching The Wire.
Which is great. I mean,
I love The Wire. And then I went to find things that were written about it. You know, this is what criticism is useful for.
Right.
That's why the New York Times turned so much writing over to Succession.
Yeah.
People wanted to discuss it after they'd seen it. I think they turned a little too many column inches over to Succession, but whatever. But I could find nothing about The Wire, nothing in the New York Times, nothing. And this was years later, a little bit in London. The London papers, nothing in the New Yorker. The New Yorker had never reviewed it. And I just thought that is really crazy. So I asked Bob Silvers if I could do it. And he said, sure. And then he started to hand me TV pieces.
Right.
And I thought, wow, am I becoming a TV reviewer? This will be a nice gig in my old age, maybe. I don't know. But I started to write about these really interesting shows.
And also quite novelistic in the way they deal with time and arcs and all of that. I mean, they really...
And the cinematography on all of them, the photography and the acting, those two things made them so unlike the television that I grew up with, to the extent that I grew up with television. Everybody does to some extent. It didn't look like a film. It looked like TV. And suddenly there's this new age of television where the television doesn't look like TV. It looks like a film. And the actors were fantastic in all of these shows. And, you know, the writing, in a sense, was the least of it. I hate to say that because it sounds like I'm not in solidarity with the writer's strike, but I am. But the actors are, you know, and the photography on the shows that I wrote about were fantastic.
Well, I think, too, story finds so many different routes to us, right? I think that there are times where even narrative, and you've been a political novelist for quite some time. I mean, if you think about it, right, domestic dramas are political. I mean, I say this all the time, and one of the examples I use is The Hours by Michael Cunningham. There's that first section of the book where, you know, the young man's mother is basically having a meltdown in her kitchen while she bakes him a cake. But as a synopsis for like the entire 1950s and being a woman and being a married woman, especially in the suburbs, like it is a wildly political piece. And no one ever really thinks about that. They just kind of think about it as someone's mommy having a meltdown in the kitchen while she bakes a cake. And I'm like, well, actually, right? Like, let's talk about what this really means. And I think it's easy for us still as a culture, which is really frustrating, to say, well, here's this television work and here's this other stuff, and look at how inherently political it all is. And I'm like, well, the stuff that you're dismissing as a domestic drama out of hand is actually covering class and money and all of the stuff that Succession is doing with like fancy sweatshirts and private planes. Novels have been doing for quite a long time, just with different terrain, right?
Right. Did you watch Succession?
I tried.
Oh, thank you.
The coverage has been fascinating. I've actually been reading a lot of the coverage just because it's fascinating, but at the same time, I'm kind of like,
doesn't it puzzle you?
Don't have enough time. You know what? I wish it puzzled me more.
I don't remember a show being covered in a major national newspaper the way this has been covered.
I thought it was very funny when the LA Times ran an obituary for the father. I thought that was a great idea. I was like, that's a way to get people to read the newspaper again. And I'm like, I would just hope that some of the folks who are watching Succession realize that, you know, there are everyday true life examples of this happening all around them. And maybe those are worth paying attention to too. There's just less cashmere or less visible cashmere. I don't really quite know how to explain it, but I don't know. I just get so much pleasure from books, and I don't always have time to watch the things that maybe I should be following up on. I think I watched maybe 2 episodes in the first season, and I was like, okay, I'm good. Thanks.
I think that's all you need. I think you need 2 episodes. I shouldn't say this, but 2 episodes in each season. That'll do, I think.
I also ran out of steam on Billions.
I didn't ever watch that.
I tried, and I was good very quickly. I was like, okay. And, all props to the teams making this stuff. I think there's a lot of juggling and a lot of hard work that goes into producing something like that. It just didn't connect for me in the way that I can connect with a book. And it might also be because there are people doing the job in front of me and I'm watching them, as opposed to thinking about what the language on the page means and where the story is and who I believe and who I trust on the page.
And there's so much more, there's so much more careful language and also interiority. You have access to everybody's interior, or at least an interiority in a novel or a short story. And you really don't have access to any interiority in screen narrative. I mean, you can guess it. You're really in the hands of the actors.
Mm-hmm.
They have to signal, and they're not even supposed to do that as performers. They're supposed to just embody without signaling. But at any rate, you don't have that. You don't have what you have in prose narrative.
I think, too, we're in an interesting moment for criticism. And I mean, certainly this is something you've been doing for the New York Review since what, 99?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So 99-ish. But you have this great way of thinking about criticism that you are coming to, less so with television, obviously, and much more with novels, but that you're coming as a practitioner, that you're not working out of theory, that you're not working out of, a plan, as it were, which I love, because you also you've taught in MFA programs at Wisconsin and now at Vanderbilt. And I love this idea of you saying, well, no, actually, I just work through this thing and I'm going to sit down and then I'm going to tell you what I think. And it's not from, you're not coming at it sideways. You're just saying, here we are. I want to talk. And
I just want to use ordinary language. I don't want to use academic language. I don't want to use professional language. I don't want any jargon to be there. And I've avoided jargon my whole life anyway. So it's not even that I'm well versed in it and just not using it. I just don't have access to it and don't want access to it. So yeah, when I'm looking at fiction, I am looking at it as a practitioner and paying attention to the voice and the structure and all that. But I want to talk about it in ordinary ways. And when I'm looking at television or film, especially television, I have looked at it sort of as a Martian, because not as a practitioner, as you say, but as someone who had a highly regulated childhood television. We were not allowed to watch more than like an hour and a half a week and things like that. And the television was in the cellar and it wasn't even in the living room. So I have sort of come as a complete outsider to the television of now. I hope that's a useful thing, to come as a sort of Martian and go, hey, look at this. I mean, to some extent, the stranger's eye or the extraterrestrial eye is what all artists are doing. They're sort of saying, let me bring this sort of odd view and this unaccustomed view to what I'm watching or what I'm seeing, what I'm observing, as opposed to someone deep in the knowledge of that thing. So you're coming in from the outside, and presumably coming in from the outside, you'll see things that people on the inside would not see. I think when one writes fiction, one has to sort of start with what's inside one's heart and what's on one's mind. When one writes criticism, one is really starting externally to oneself, but it's having a conversation, obviously, with things inside you, but you don't begin there necessarily. You sort of begin more externally.
I mean, obviously, you're just going to keep doing the novels when you feel like them, and the stories when you feel like doing them, and the criticism when, you know, the spirit moves you, as it were. But have you thought about what's next? I mean, one of the things I do appreciate is we just get work from you when we get work from you. And, you know, it's kind of a delight. And it's like, oh, there's a new Lorrie Moore.
Oh, well, she's still alive? Yeah, or who is she? I started something in Berlin, so I will be working on that. And I owe the New York Review a review. I've owed it to them for a while. We'll see if I can complete that. But there will be other things. I won't die. I won't die.
That's okay. Please don't. But more importantly, I mean, I liked...
And even if I do die, guess what? I can come back.
But I mean, also just piecing together what you'd been saying and then realizing that, you know, I Am Homeless If This Is Not My Home was the book you were talking about. It's like, you know, eventually we can work backwards. That's kind of the fun.
Because I think I said early on that I was doing a ghost story years ago. This is sort of my ghost story. And one of the next things that I will have some Berlin in it.
Okay.
Berlin is the most astonishing city historically of the 20th century, I think. Very tragic city, very complicated, and now very, you know, very interesting and alive, but really processing so much history there. It reminded me a little bit of the South in terms of all the sort of tragic history that has to be processed there.
I can see that. I'm just going to sit here quietly while you do your thing. That is a novel I would very much like to. That does feel more like a novel than stories. I don't know. Am I wrong about that?
I don't know.
The Berlin Project. Okay.
Let's see. I'm not going to.
Sorry. Right. You don't like to talk about. I have
no contracts right now, so I'm not contracted for anything. It doesn't have to be one thing or another.
Okay. I'm going to make the wheel in my head stop turning because now because also I finished the new. It's 192 pages.
Well, it's dense.
I Am Homeless.
It's sometimes dense, and sometimes the dialogue moves along quickly, and then sometimes the writing gets more compact and compressed.
Didn't feel like it was dense at all. I felt like it really felt like it flew for me, and it flew not because I was reading a novel by you so much as I really was invested in puzzling out where we were going. That's what I wanted to know where Finn and Lily and Max and Elizabeth were taking us. I was just like, what? And it was so satisfying. And that's the thing that I really want to keep coming back to. And I know you and I were joking about beach reading before we started taping. And I'm the kind of person who takes Per Pettersson's Out Stealing Horses to the beach. So I know other people do not do that. But I would say, you know, the new one is totally perfect beach reading.
Oh, good.
It can be read anywhere. It can be read in your backyard. It can be read on the sofa. It can be read on the beach. It's just, the language is really satisfying. The emotional journey is really satisfying. The characters, I mean, they're great. And yet I was kind of like, do I trust you? Where are you going with? I mean, Lily is a therapy clown. I'm going to just let that hang out there. Lily's a therapy clown.
She's not a very good one.
No, but she's still a therapy.
I guess I just sucked at it, she said.
Yeah. Well, there's that.
Yeah.
Do you miss this world? Do you miss these characters? Do you miss this?
I sort of do and sort of don't.
Okay.
I mean, you know, with A Gate at the Stairs, I missed Elsie Kelchin for a whole year after.
Oh, wow. Okay. I can see that.
I'm not really going to miss Finn for a whole year. He's a different sort of character. Yeah. But do I feel attached to him? Do I think about him? Sure.
Yeah.
And Lily, sure. And everybody else in there, sure. Maybe because they're a little older than Tassie Kelchin was in A Gate at the Stairs. I feel like the characters in this novel, their lives are already formed and made. And A Gate at the Stairs, there were still some questions as to what was going to happen to her. You know, who would she be when she was 40? You don't really know. So
I also don't want readers to lose sight of the fact that Finn and Lily do have a love story.
it's a love story. It's supposed to be a love story.
It's a little trippy.
All love stories maybe test people's ideas of love a little bit and maybe test their credulity a little bit. It has a little bit of anger in it because of the issues that we mentioned before, but because we're trying to talk around a lot of things without it's supposed to be a love story, and he loves her, and I think she loves him.
I think she does. I think
and
she does.
Certainly they had a love of some sort for a while, prior to when the book begins, and they make reference to that, to when they met, and blah blah blah. So it is supposed to be a love story. It's supposed to be a ghost story. I am homeless. If this is not my home, it's supposed to sound like a blues song.
Yeah,
it does.
Yes, ma'am, it does.
And it's about, it's about not feeling quite at home in your own life, which none of these characters quite do. And that's the blues, feeling that you're not quite in the right place.
It's so satisfying, this book.
Oh,
it's so satisfying.
Thank you.
All right, that seems like a really good place to wrap. As much as I would rather just keep hanging out with you, you have things to do. So I Am Homeless, If This Is Not My Home, is out now. Lorrie Moore, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over.
Thank you so much.
Hello, readers. We're back with another TBR Topoff. We're going to recommend a couple of fantastic books to go along with the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Lorrie Moore. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble here in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm joined by my book buddy, Madyson. Hi, Madyson. Where are you at?
I am here at my home store in Los Angeles.
So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I've been very excited for anything new by Lorrie Moore, and this is a wild, I guess, departure, but just a wild setup for her. But her writing style is something that I really cherish, and it made me think of something I read recently that I really loved, and that is The Department of Speculations by Jenny Offill. Oh my God, this book. It is a novella, essentially, made up of phrases, thoughts, random facts, all building essentially the psyche and heart of a woman who is just this narrator that you don't really know where she lands until these small phrases start to build and build and build, and by the time you finish the book, you have a complete person. It's essentially the story of a woman who is reflecting on her life and marriage as it begins to unravel. The pure moments, the shameful choices, the longing, and the regret. But it's the way that Offill crystallizes each sentence and each phrase for maximum effect. If you were to just glance at the book, it's essentially just sentences broken up that has a trajectory, has a narrative flow, but it's just done so well. It's these quick thoughts, it's these flashes of memory, and this undercurrent of this mounting anger and resentment that I think is probably deserved once you get to know this character. It's a book that is best read quickly, right up to the end, and then retraced slowly and with care. It's one of those books that you finish and you go, okay, let's do this again from a different angle. And it's funny. It's an intelligent wryness that I think that can catch you off guard as you try to sift through these bits and bobs of feelings and thoughts that make the book up. There are these great surprises that can make you giggle. At least make an eyebrow raise. This is a book that has more honesty packed into it than a title that I've read in a long time. And it's one that I plan to revisit many times over. And that is Department of Speculations by Jenny Offill. Madyson, what do you have for us?
Yes. Well, first, we love a book that you can come back to. That's always important. Never read the same book twice because it gives you something different every time. That was a weird way I said that, but...
No, I love it.
When I was thinking of a book, I came to one that for like months now, I just keep picking up. I was like, I'm reading this. Like I finally just gave in and read it because I had been walking around the store carrying it. And that was Summer Suns by Lee Mandello. I love this book. I will say just a little bit of a trigger warning. It does deal with suicide. Just want to put that out there. So if that's something you do not want to read about, I would not pick this book up. It is an adult horror novel with a hint of dark academia, which I think is one of my favorite genres. So in this story, you have Andrew and Eddie, who are like two best friends. They were like so in sync, so compatible, so involved in each other's lives. And then within the span of 6 months, that kind of all disappears. So Eddie goes to Vanderbilt before Andrew. So he goes 6 months before, and then days before Andrew is supposed to get there, Eddie dies in what is, people believe, a suicide. Andrew goes and needs to find what actually happened. And in doing so, uncovers, I think, an Eddie he never expected. And there's so many twists and turns within this novel that I think the writer does so well that just like keeps you reading. Like, it's dubbed like a perfect summer read, and it's not like your traditional beach read. It is a summer read in that the prose is so lyrical, the diverse casting, and it's done so well. And it addresses so many issues of like race, class, privilege, sexuality. It hits all those topics and doesn't make you feel overwhelmed by those topics. It really is just connected and interwoven in such a beautiful way while you're discovering this secondary life Eddie had before Andrew even got there. So it's definitely a page turner. I think it has a lot of quirks. It has a lot of twists and turns. The writing, I think, for me is the best part. Because when you like pick up a book, it feels thick. It's one of those books that feels thick, but when you're reading it, like you're just flying through it. Like it could be the length of a novella, but like the writing pulls you in so much. Like that's how it feels. You get through it so fast, and then you're left with like, I think, wanting more from the story. And I think it's a step through this like horror genre that isn't like, slasher, or there is like an element of like spookiness, but it's definitely a horror that leaves you thinking, which sometimes, psychological horror, that's the word I'm looking for. I love those. I love when an author can get into my head, which is why I chose Summer Suns by Lynn Mandello, and I think it pairs really, really well.
I like that pick. You're right, the book has a lyrical quality to it. It has like a highbrow horror. It was kind of how it was described to me, and I like the character work in this. I think that it's interesting to revisit somebody's life after they've gone and uncover things about yourself at the same time. So nice choice. But that's all we have for today. Wah, wah. But don't worry, we'll be back sometime soon. But thank you so much for tuning into Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble, pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester.
And I'm Madison. You can follow my home store at BN Events Grove.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Goodbye.
Happy reading. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.